I really do think this is one of those arguments that, at least in my view, is kind of straightforwardly correct. Like, this has not been a very inventive argument. I just listed some harms. I noted that these are classically the types of harms that ought to be the targets of bans as well as international bans, spelled out some precedents, and discussed how it can be done in a way that maximizes benefit and minimizes harm.
All right, welcome everyone. Let's get started. I'm so privileged to be joined by many people, including the chair of the philosophy department, not to put him on blast, but he's here. That's exciting. But anyways, hello everyone and welcome to Towards a Global Ban on Industrial Animal Agriculture by 2050. I'm Talia Sherman. I'm a junior at Brown studying linguistics and English, and I am very proud to be here in my role as vice president of Brown's chapter of Allied Scholars for Animal Protection, or ASAP. At ASAP, we are building a unified campus animal advocacy infrastructure across the United States and beyond. So that means we highlight ethical, environmental, and public health issues related to animal consumption and farming. We emphasize the urgency of taking action and train the next generation of influential animal advocates. But today, we are thrilled to host Professor Jeff Sebo. Jeff is an associate professor of environmental studies, as well as an affiliated professor of bioethics, medical ethics, philosophy, and law at New York University. Outside of the classroom, he serves as the director of the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection and the Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy, as well as co-director of the Wild Animal Welfare Program at NYU. His research focuses on moral philosophy, legal philosophy, philosophy of mind, animal minds and policy, AI minds, ethics and policy, global health and climate ethics and policy, and global priorities research. Among other books, he is the author of The Moral Circle and Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves. We cannot be happier to have him here with us today. Thank you, Jeff, and take it away.
Well, thank you so much again for inviting me, and sorry for not being able to be there in person. I wish I could be, hopefully another time soon. But I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody online, and really looking forward to the conversation. And so special thanks to Talia, who arranged all this, as well as Benny and others for supporting this event. I really, really do appreciate it. And to everybody attending too. I recognize a couple of names as well. And thanks for tuning in. I know this is a busy time. So as Talia said, this talk and conversation is going to be about the case for working towards a global ban on industrial animal agriculture by 2050. And this is based on a forthcoming law review article that I co-authored with my colleagues Tony Sims and Emma Dietz. So shout out to them and a bunch of colleagues, particularly Cleo Vercal gave us lots of helpful input, and shout out to them as well. And this is a law review article making the case for not only a ban on industrial animal agriculture, but international coordination around a ban on industrial animal agriculture. And not only as a long-term goal, but as a targeted goal by 2050. This is obviously aspirational. There are going to be all kinds of obstacles, but I do think it helps to think seriously about what legal regulation would look like in this space, because typically conversations about food ethics, when we think about the harms of factory farming and industrial animal agriculture, focus on individual consumer action. But as we know from decades of conversation, individual consumer action, while useful and important, is not in and of itself sufficient to address the global harms caused by factory farming and industrial animal agriculture. We need grassroots social change, but then we also need top-down policy change. And I think that should eventually culminate in what amounts to a global ban on this food system. So what I'm going to do in this talk is make this case at a high level and consider pathways and timelines and other factors that are going to be important for planning. And we can start by defining industrial animal agriculture and observing that this food system is increasingly central, unfortunately also increasingly harmful. We can then think about some of the specific harms, in particular the environmental harms, the public health harms, and the social harms, both for workers and animals and other stakeholders of this global food system. And then we can directly think about the case for a legal ban and a global legal ban on this food system, why these environmental, public health, and social harms together support specifically a global ban, in addition to other mechanisms that we may use to gradually phase the system down and phase up humane and healthful and sustainable alternatives. And finally, we can think, in addition to about precedents of various kinds, we can think about pathways and timelines drawn from precedents of various kinds. So that is the plan for the discussion. And then I hope there will be plenty of time for conversation, for questions, for comments, for objections. So please do be thinking about what you would like to contribute. And at the end of the talk, which will take maybe 35, 45 minutes, then there will be plenty of time for just direct back and forth. Okay. So with all that in mind, we can start by defining industrial animal agriculture, as I will be using this term in this talk. Different people use this term in different ways. I will be using it to refer to a pair of animal-sourced food systems, the first of which we can think of as intensive industrial animal agriculture. So when people talk about CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, or factory farms, large facilities where a large number of animals are kept in intensive confinement, this is what I mean by intensive industrial animal agriculture. And this is quite a significant food system. Right now, depending on how you define the details, an estimated about 75% of farmed land animals and about 99% of farmed aquatic animals are bred and raised in CAFOs, factory farms, intensive industrial animal farms. So that is one half of what I will be talking about here. The other half we can think of as large-scale extensive animal farming. So this is animal farming where animals have more space, but it, for that reason, takes up a lot of land, a lot of water, contributes more to deforestation and biodiversity loss. So think of large-scale cattle farming, beef and dairy farming in the Amazon as one example. And that causes a different and overlapping set of harms, maybe a little bit less acute animal welfare harms, maybe a little bit more acute land use change and deforestation and biodiversity loss and climate change harms. Okay, so when I talk about industrial animal agriculture in this conversation, I am talking about intensive and or large-scale extensive animal farming of those types. Now that leaves out what we might think of as small-scale extensive animal farming. So if you picture the kind of idyllic local, organic, free-range animal farm that might dot the landscape in like upstate New York or in various developing countries where people still use such food systems to meet their basic needs, those are not going to be targeted in this talk. I think that there are questions to ask about whether the way they treat animals is appropriate, if and when there are alternatives that people can access and can afford. But I am setting those conversations to the side for now. And what I will be proposing is that governments work together towards a global ban on industrial animal agriculture, understood as intensive and or large-scale extensive animal farming. And then as we work together to phase down those systems and phase up alternatives, we can debate along the way what to do with the remaining small-scale extensive animal farms that are not targeted by the present proposal. Okay, so that is what I mean. And as I will emphasize throughout the talk, different kinds of industrial animal agriculture cause different kinds of harm. Intensive systems are going to, as I said, more acutely cause local pollution, harm workers, harm animals, but extensive forms are going to more acutely consume land, consume water, contribute to deforestation, biodiversity loss, climate change. Both in different ways are going to contribute to public and global health harms. So what is going to be essential to the talk is the idea that both forms of industrial animal agriculture cause massive and unnecessary harm to vulnerable populations, but the details are going to differ. And for that reason, it is useful to think of these food systems as different but overlapping, but part of the same general problem. I hope that is clear enough, but we can discuss it more over the course of the talk and conversation. Now, it is worth briefly surveying the harms of these food systems. I trust most people tuning into this talk are broadly aware of the harms of factory farming and industrial animal agriculture, and we probably do not need to belabor rehearsing the long list of harms that these systems cause. But I think it is at least worth noting that there are substantial harms across what we can describe as three general categories. The first being environmental, the second being public health, and the third being social. So, regarding environmental harms, and as I said, both of these types of food systems, intensive and large scale, extensive, cause all of these types of harms, but in different ways and to different degrees. And large scale, extensive animal farming is particularly responsible for many of the environmental harms we associate with animal farming. And that includes the big three: pollution, biodiversity loss, and climate change. Local pollution is particularly bad for intensive animal farming because you accumulate so much toxic, concentrated, untreated animal waste that you then have to distribute it on the land around the farms at levels that the land cannot sustain and absorb. And so you end up collecting the waste on top of the land. It goes into the soil, it goes into the water, it goes into the air, it causes mental and physical health problems for workers in the local community. That is a significant environmental harm of intensive animal agriculture. Additionally, you have to grow plants to feed the animals, a lot of corn, a lot of soy. And because you lose energy in the conversion of feed to flesh, even intensive animal farming has a pretty big land footprint because you got to grow more plants to feed the animals than you would need to grow in order to feed humans directly. So, in addition to local pollution, there is local land use change and associated environmental costs, even for the intensive form. But these costs are really aggravated with the extensive form because it takes a lot of land to, for example, raise cattle for beef or for dairy. And then you still, in some cases, need food to feed them, or you use enough land to feed them directly. You also have to consume a lot of water, both to give to the animals and to irrigate the plants that you would be using to feed the animals. And so this food system is responsible for a lot of land use change. That drives deforestation. Deforestation, in turn, is responsible for a lot of biodiversity loss because forests are very biodiverse terrestrial environments. And there are various other problems with deforestation that we can discuss in the conversation, if you would like, associated with public health costs and so on. And of course, climate change is the other major environmental harm. Animal agriculture, and this is an older estimate, is responsible for an estimated 9% of carbon dioxide emissions, 37% of methane emissions, and 65% of nitrous oxide emissions. And that adds up to an estimated 15 to 20% conservatively of global human-caused greenhouse gas emissions over a 100-year timescale. And a lot of that is because of what happens on the farms, like methane emissions from the cows, but a lot of it is also because of what happens via land use change. Forests, in addition to being very biodiverse areas, they capture and store carbon dioxide under the ground. And so when you cut down a forest to create a feedlot, you release a bunch of stored carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and you diminish the planet's ability to capture and store carbon dioxide in the future. So that is another substantial environmental harm. So pollution, biodiversity loss, and climate change are all significant impacts of especially extensive industrial animal agriculture, but to some extent both. Now you also have public health costs, and these are divided into two main categories, one being the emergence of infectious diseases and the other being the emergence of increased antibiotic and antimicrobial resistance. And these happen in different ways in both the intensive and extensive forms of animal agriculture. With intensive animal farming, you really accelerate the emergence of infectious diseases because you have large numbers of animals who can carry zoonotic diseases with weakened immune systems due to stress, living together in cramped and toxic environments in their own waste. That is the perfect breeding ground for novel pathogens like new kinds of bird flu, new kinds of swine flu, new variants of COVID-19. These can all emerge and have all emerged from animal farms because there are so many animals with weakened immune systems living together in their own waste. And of course, they have to interact with workers, and that can cause diseases to spread to workers, to other people in the local community. So that is an acute public health risk of intensive animal farming. Now, part of how you then deal with that, because you were not able to provide individualized veterinary care for that many animals in a factory farm, in a CAFO, you then use antibiotics or antimicrobials, both to stimulate growth and to suppress the spread of diseases. And that does, to some extent, help suppress the spread of diseases, but it also, to some extent, gives bacteria and viruses more opportunity to evolve resistance to our antibiotics and antimicrobials. And this is part of why factory farms are not only the site of novel pathogens, but antibiotic and antimicrobial resistant novel pathogens. And those are the ones that really constitute an elevated risk of a new epidemic or a new pandemic of some kind. Now, as I said, extensive animal farming can also generate public health risks. And part of how it does that is not only by also maintaining populations of animals who can carry zoonotic diseases, but also by, again, accelerating deforestation, which, in addition to having a biodiversity cost and a climate change cost, it can have a public health cost because it can increase interactions between humans and wild animals who carry zoonotic diseases. And it can also reduce forested biodiversity, which, in addition to being generally good for ecosystem services, it also functions as a buffer against the spread of zoonotic diseases in wild animal populations. So when you engage in deforestation, not only are humans interacting with wild animals who carry diseases more, but wild animals are spreading diseases among each other more. And that can all cause more diseases to spread. So lots of public health risks too. And then finally, there are social costs and harms associated with industrial animal agriculture. And this can broadly be divided into human and non-human welfare harms and rights violations. So workers are famously vulnerable populations, especially in industrial animal agriculture in its intensive form. So workers at factory farms and slaughterhouses, they have to do difficult, demanding, dangerous, repetitive, violent work that causes a lot of physical and mental health problems. They do that with poor compensation, very few worker protections, and because the work is so difficult, dangerous, and unpleasant, very few people voluntarily take these jobs as opposed to other jobs. And that means these jobs often fall to the most vulnerable members of our communities. And that might include migrant workers, it might include people from low-income households. And so workers often are exploited and harmed, and their rights are violated. And they might not be able or willing or know that they even can advocate for themselves and defend their own rights because they might fear being punished, they might fear being deported, and so workers can have a very hard time in this food system. Of course, and this is not to equate these two populations at all, but non-human animals themselves are very vulnerable in animal farming, particularly intensive industrial animal agriculture. Just to put this food system into perspective, we now do have an industry that brings into existence more than 100 billion, possibly more than 200 billion farmed vertebrates per year when you consider land and aquatic vertebrates, as well as more than 1 trillion farmed invertebrates per year when you consider not only lobsters and shrimps, but also insects. So that is already an order of magnitude more animals per year than the entire total number of humans who have ever existed. There have been about 120 billion humans from the dawn of time until now. And we kill at least an order of magnitude more captive non-humans per year for food than that number, than the total number of humans who have ever existed. And again, about 75% of farmed land animals are intensively farmed. About 99% of farmed aquatic animals are intensively farmed. These animals really do suffer a lot in intensive confinement. They are bred to grow as big as possible, as quickly as possible, or to produce as much as possible, as quickly as possible. They are often mutilated without anesthesia, like debeaked or tail docked, separated from their families, kept in these cramped and toxic spaces and in stressed conditions, incentivized or made to overeat, transported across great distances without access to food, water, veterinary care, and then killed on what can only be described as industrial disassembly lines that operate way too fast to ensure worker protection or especially humane slaughter. Even if that is a goal, it often is not the consequence. So this is not a pleasant life for all of, especially the chickens and fishes in intensive industrial animal agriculture, which constitutes the vast majority of vertebrates used in this space. So this is a food system that, as I said, is increasingly central to our global economy and food supply, but also increasingly harmful across these domains: environmental harms, public health harms, and social harms for both workers and animals. And while different forms of industrial animal agriculture cause different harms, all forms of what I am describing as industrial animal agriculture do cause some combination of these harms. So, for example, intensive chicken farming might be a little bit better for the climate and for biodiversity than extensive beef and dairy farming. But extensive beef and dairy farming is a little bit better for animal welfare than intensive chicken farming, because you are killing fewer animals per unit of food produced. And then both in different ways are better and worse from a public health perspective. One causes more diseases to emerge on the farm. The other causes more diseases to emerge through its contribution to deforestation. So it is true that some are a little bit better than others on some fronts, but they are all quite bad on some of these fronts, especially in comparison to other options like plant farming, like fungus farming, like plant-based and cultivated meat production. And that is what is going to matter. Okay, now having surveyed the harms, which again, I expect many people here are going to be familiar with, we can now at a high level present what I take to be not only a moral, but also a legal case for not only ending, but banning the system, not only regionally, but globally. So this is going to be a moral and legal case for ending and banning regionally and globally industrial animal agriculture in both its intensive and large-scale extensive forms. Again, this is setting to the side, for purposes of this conversation, what we can take to be small-scale, extensive animal farming. The case is pretty straightforward, but it does have a few elements that are worth emphasizing. The first part of the case, simply for banning this food system, is that it causes intentional, foreseeable harm to vulnerable populations against their will unnecessarily. And there are benefits to not only ending, but also banning such a practice. So first of all, it does cause a massive and unnecessary amount of harm, either intentionally or at least foreseeably. Perhaps we could have been forgiven 75 years ago when this food system was scaling up for not appreciating that it causes many of the harms that it caused. Our understanding of animal consciousness and sentience was much earlier than many more people in the philosophical and scientific communities believed that farmed animals, including cows and pigs and chickens, were either not conscious or not very conscious. So we might not have been as aware of the animal welfare harms. We also were not as aware of all of the public health risks, including risks involving infectious disease emergence and antibiotic and antimicrobial resistance. We were not as aware of all of the risks associated with biodiversity loss and climate change. We perhaps should have been. We were perhaps culpable for not being more aware of these issues at that point. Those ideas were still working their way through the academy, through advocacy and policy spaces. But at this point, we are aware of these risks. We know that these are harmful consequences of this food system. And so at this point, maintaining this food systems means intentionally or at least foreseeably causing a massive and unnecessary amount of harm. And crucially, this harm is being inflicted not only on those of us who voluntarily opt into this food system as producers and consumers, but also individuals who are not able or not willing to be a part of this food system. So not non-human animals who have no say in whether they are involved in industrial animal agriculture, or members of other nations or future generations who have no say on whether climate harms are inflicted upon them because they might not even exist yet, but they will eventually be born into the world we create in part through the food system that we build and sustain. So this is a massive and unnecessary amount of harm that we are intentionally, or at least foreseeably, inflicting on basically individuals all over the world. In many cases, those are individuals who are opting into the food system and making an informed decision about whether the benefits outweigh the cost for them. But in many cases, they either have no opportunity to participate in those decisions, or they are trying to opt out, but having the harms inflicted upon them anyway. And this is a classic fact pattern where a ban can be warranted. We can debate whether a ban is an appropriate response to people knowingly and willingly causing harm to themselves. Libertarians will often, perhaps reasonably, argue that people should be free to smoke cigarettes, even if that makes them sick, or not wear motorcycle helmets, even if that puts them at risk of injury. But this is a situation where the risks and harms are being inflicted on others, on vulnerable populations against their will. And that makes a harm a little bit more amenable to a ban. Now, in addition to a ban being warranted, a global ban is warranted because the harms and the rights violations in this case have a particular character, a character that requires global coordinated action in order for these harms and rights violations to be addressed. So first of all, many of the harms and rights violations associated with industrial animal agriculture are transboundary harms. That means they are not contained within the jurisdiction in which the harmful behaviors occur. So climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, public health risks like pandemics, these are all classic examples of harms that do not respect our, political borders. So if one nation or one region makes a certain choice about which food systems to scale up, the other ones just will suffer many of the impacts of those food systems. So these are transboundary harms. And this is also a situation that involves various kinds of international or global coordination or collective action problems. So, for example, it creates a risk of free riding. And what that means is if there are only national or regional bans, then everyone will be incentivized to be a free rider, to get all the benefits of a reduction in industrial animal agriculture without incurring the costs of food system reform. So everyone will wait for everyone else to take those steps so they can get the benefits without incurring the costs. And you need coordination so that everyone works together to secure the benefits by collectively distributing and absorbing the costs. There can also be a risk of leakage with national or regional bans. And that means a risk that you ban a harmful activity in one place, and so all it does is incentivize people relocating to another place. So you reduce a certain amount of animal farming in one region, and then that causes it to increase in another region, and the global supply of animal farming remains the same. So the same harms are occurring, but simply occurring in different places with fewer regulations. So you once again need coordinated activity in order to prevent not only free riding, but also leakage. Another problem in this situation is you can have high administrative costs associated with a lot of different policies in a lot of different nations and regions. And then that can increase the costs across the board for producers and consumers, because now you have 50 different set of standards you have to be complying with and figuring out how to send food to different places that comply with different standards. And coordinating on a single set of standards can be useful for reducing those costs and that administrative burden and making the system more legible and accessible for producers and consumers. And finally, in this situation, you can also have a risk of global injustice, because as with fossil fuels and other situations related to pollution, biodiversity loss, climate change, This is a situation where some actors, some companies, some nations are disproportionately responsible and others will be disproportionately burdened. So, for example, high income nations in the global north tend to be disproportionately responsible for harms associated with fossil fuel use, factory farming, climate change. And then lower income countries in the global south will be disproportionately burdened by many of the public health and environmental effects of these activities in these industries. And as with energy reform and phasing down fossil fuels and phasing up alternative energy systems, you need global coordination facilitated through international communities in order to ensure that our global solutions are just and that the actors who are disproportionately responsible bear more of the cost of the reform, and actors who are disproportionately burdened, they receive more assistance over the course of the reform. So just in sum, then, the high level case for pursuing a global ban is that, first of all, you have all of the elements that make a ban appropriate. There are environmental, public health, and social harms. They are massive, unnecessary, either intentional or at least foreseeable, and they are inflicted on vulnerable populations against their will. So this is the kind of harm that a government is well within its rights and arguably responsibility to not only end but ban, because banning, in addition to ending and locking in the end, it sends a signal that this kind of activity is not acceptable in modern society when alternatives are available. And then additionally, a global ban is warranted because these are, in many cases, transboundary harms and rights violations that raise all kinds of coordination and collective action problems like free riding, like leakage, like high administrative costs, like global injustice, that coordinated regulation and action is needed to address. So that is the high level case for a ban. Now, I will note at this point that we also have all kinds of precedents for not only regulations and bans, but international and global regulations and bans that address these kinds of harms. And that is not to say that the harms of industrial animal agriculture are exactly like the harms of these other practices that have been the target of international coordinated regulation or bans. But it is to say that there is ample precedent for global regulation or bans for practices that cause large scale, massive, unnecessary environmental, public health, and social harms against vulnerable populations, against their wills, in ways that do raise many of these coordination and collective action problems. So in the environmental context, for example, we have precedents involving the ozone layer, mercury. So the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer was a remarkably successful example of international action addressing an urgent transboundary environmental problem. There have also been other proposals now that are increasingly being taken up and taken seriously by governments regarding a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. This would be coordinated international action intended to secure non-proliferation of fossil fuels, so stop them from being used even more, and then eventually phasing down the use of existing fossil fuels and replacing them with alternative energy sources on the model of nuclear non-proliferation. In the public health domain, we have all kinds of precedents too. And that includes precedents involving coordinated international action on tobacco use, which actually is, to a much greater extent, a harm that people inflict upon themselves as opposed to others, though, of course, there are ongoing discussions about the effects of secondhand smoke. But there has been coordinated international action on tobacco, on narcotic drugs, and then, of course, there now are increasingly discussions about international action on preventing and preparing for epidemics and pandemics of the kind that could be amplified by industrial animal agriculture. And then, of course, there are all kinds of coordinated international action related to social harms too. And here I want to especially emphasize that I am not equating the social harms that have previously been addressed by these precedents and those caused by industrial animal agriculture. But they are noteworthy because they show that we do have a precedent for coordinated international regulation and bans on activities, not only on products, but also on processes, and not only for environmental and public health reasons, but also for social and ethical reasons. And so that includes international agreements related to minimum ages for child labor, international agreements related to banning forced labor and trafficking, and other such agreements that are really intended to address processes that we take to be unethical and unjust. And again, that is not to say that these are exactly like those, but it is to say there is at least a precedent for allowing processes to be the targeted of bans and for them to be the targets of bans on ethical and social grounds. And so that invites the question whether the kinds of social harms inflicted upon workers and or animals are, for maybe different or overlapping reasons, also the appropriate targets of international action. And then you also have international precedents related to activities that in some way or another cause all three kinds of these harms at the same time. So think about international regulation involving military conduct and weapons of war. There are global agreements related to the use of nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, in part because of the direct harm they cause to citizens, and also in part because of the ongoing public health and environmental risks that they inflict on entire regions. There are also, of course, bans associated with how much you can directly target non-combatants in the course of military activity, to how you treat combatants in terms of torture and so on. These are all examples of environmental, public health, and social harms being addressed by international agreements in a particular domain. And of course, military activity and food production are different, but they have at least this much in common. They are both really important activities that nevertheless are quite fraught and can cause public health and environmental harms as well as social harms. In the case of military, it serves a vital purpose, defense, but it can cause all kinds of environmental and public health harms related to the use of nuclear or chemical or biological weapons. It can also involve social harms in the course of carrying out military campaigns with how you target civilians or even combatants with torture, for example. And so the goal of this regulation is to ensure that we can achieve the vital purpose, self-defense and other defense, but in a way that mitigates these risks and harms along the way. And that is the case with food too. It serves a vital purpose, sustenance. We need to feed ourselves. That is not in question. But our current food system does that in a way that causes a lot of environmental and public health harms and social harms in the process. And so the goal of international regulation should likewise be to ensure that we can indeed continue to realize this vital purpose that the food system is serving, but in a way that mitigates and minimizes, reduces these environmental and public health and social harms along the way. And we do have these precedents and instruments that have been developed in these other contexts: environmental, public health, social, and combined in the case of, for example, military. And what I am now suggesting is that in light of the clear environmental, public health, and social harms of our increasingly global industrial animal agricultural food system, we should at least ask the question whether they are similarly the types of harms that could be targeted by coordinated international action. And then if so, what the details of that coordinated international action should look like. And that is what I will turn to in the final part of the talk. But before I do that, I will briefly address a few objections that people might have to the idea of a global ban on industrial animal agriculture by 2050. And I'll speak to them briefly, and then we can discuss them more in the Q&A if you would like. The first is that this is impossible. We are never going to ban industrial animal agriculture obviously, like anytime anyone even suggests the tiniest reform to the food system, it immediately gets shut down by the industry and politicians who are connected to the industry. And the people who propose this tiny reform are immediately accused of wanting to take away your hamburgers and are villainized. And so when I come along and say, hey, we actually should eventually take away your hamburgers, of course, this is going to be met with even more resistance. It is not going to happen. We should not even bother to talk about it. And we should instead talk about more modest reforms that might actually be achievable and sustainable in the real world. All I will say to that is that this is a situation where change is unfortunately very difficult and certainly is not going to happen overnight. I do think change this level of change by 2030 or even 2035 or 2040, it might genuinely be impossible. But if we think on slightly longer time horizons, it stops being impossible and it starts being instead possible, but very difficult. And I think that is how we should think about a long-term aspiration like banning industrial animal agriculture by 2050. It's not impossible, but it is very, very difficult. And it helps, I think, to keep in mind the various steps that can be taken along the way that will make it more and more likely to be realized. In a moment, I'll talk about informational policies and financial policies and regulatory policies and just transition policies that can be pursued incrementally. And if those policies are pursued incrementally, then we will gradually phase down industrial animal agriculture and gradually phase up humane and healthful and sustainable alternatives while supporting consumers and farmers and workers who depend on this food system along the way. And as we do that, then over 5 years, over 10 years, over 15 years, people gradually become less dependent on industrial animal agriculture, more dependent on alternatives, gradually start to experience more public health crises, more extreme weather events associated with industrial animal agriculture. And so the ethical considerations, not only involving our increasing awareness of animal consciousness and sentience, but also the links between industrial animal agriculture and pandemics and climate change, we will gradually become more aware of all of that. And since we are also gradually becoming less dependent on this food system and having more access to alternatives that are affordable, that are desirable, we will start to internalize the ethical arguments more and like commit to them a little bit more. And there will be a tipping point at some point where it becomes feasible to actually really invest in, lean into the development of these alternatives where they become a little bit more the center of gravity. And at that point, a ban will seem less unthinkable than it seems right now. It's one of those situations where this is the kind of transformative change that seems impossible until it happens. And then when it does happen, it seems inevitable. It seems like it was always, of course, going to happen. And the only question is, man, how did it take us this long to end one of the worst things we have ever done as a species, right? And in reality, this kind of change is neither impossible nor inevitable. Both of those perceptions are inaccurate. It is instead, like I said before, possible but difficult. So that just means we need to do everything we can to create the conditions where you can eventually build momentum and make it possible and then actual. And then it will seem inevitable in retrospect. That will be false. It was not inevitable. But we got to get to the point where it seems that way, where that is the mistake we are making instead of our present mistake of thinking it is impossible. Okay. Now, another objection that people will have is that this is illiberal. It is taking away a choice that many people value, the choice to eat meat, dairy, eggs, etc. And I will just respond to this briefly for now, and then we can talk about it more in the Q&A if you like. But my brief response is that it is not illiberal because as the great liberal philosophers have gone to great lengths to argue, what liberalism means at most is that we have a right to harm ourselves without interference from the government. It does not mean that we have a right to cause massive and unnecessary harm to vulnerable populations against their will. That is classically the kind of harm that the government is expected to prevent without thereby becoming illiberal. And as an aside, I can note that a world without industrial animal agriculture is in general going to be a world with more liberty, not with less liberty. Not only will we be able to use plant-based and cultivated meat production to increase even more kinds of meat than we have right now, and dairy and eggs, but we will also be preventing all of the deprivations of liberty that are inflicted upon farmed animals at present, as well as all of the deprivations of liberty that are inflicted upon humans because of an increase in the frequency and the intensity of disease outbreaks, fires, floods, heat waves, droughts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there will be more liberty, not less, in a world without industrial animal agriculture. And it already does have a surprising amount of democratic support, given how stigmatized it often is in mainstream conversations. And so I do think that as we create the conditions that make it more feasible to end and ban industrial animal agriculture, you naturally will see public support emerge for ending and banning it. And it will be democratically selected and not merely imposed on the demos by the governments. That is a prediction. Those are conditions that we have to create through thoughtful education, advocacy, and gradual change to our food system. But I do believe those conditions can and will be created. And then it will be consistent with and a product of liberalism and democracy, as opposed to in any way in tension with them. And then the final objection that people might offer is that it is harmful. In addition to potentially being illiberal, and in addition to not even being possible in the first place, it is harmful because not only are there opportunity costs associated with advocating for this as opposed to other more modest reforms, but we would also be harming or disrupting or displacing food systems on which people, especially vulnerable populations, rely for income or food. And that is definitely true. Any major social, legal, political, economic transition is going to be disruptive, and that is going to have risks and costs and harms that we need to take very seriously. We should not downplay that. Not only is a future plant-based food system that we might be replacing industrial animal agriculture with, that is going to be harmful in various ways, but additionally, the transition to that food system is going to be rocky, and there will be winners and losers, and we have to take that seriously. So all I will say, again, briefly in response to this objection right now, and then we can discuss it more in the Q&A if you like, is that first of all, nothing is harm-free. No food system is harm-free, and no path forward is harm-free. So we cannot set the bar so high that no change is acceptable unless it is literally harm-free. Everything is going to cause harm. Everything is going to be disruptive in one way or another. So the question is not how to eliminate harm. The question is how to minimize harm. And when you stack up the harms of industrial animal agriculture to workers, to animals, to public health, to the environment, eventually to the economy, when we have to deal with future pandemics and the ongoing effects of climate change, when you stack up those harms against the harms of a disruptive transition to an alternative food system over the course of 25 years by 2050, with thoughtful, just transition policies in place to mitigate the harms and find alternative sources of food and income for vulnerable populations. In that situation, I think that there is a good case for saying that while there still will be harms associated with the transition, they will clearly be lesser on the whole than the harms associated with ongoing entrenchment of industrial animal agriculture in our global economy. And so I think the focus should be not on maintaining the status quo out of a fear of the harm of disruptive alternatives, but rather having a real 25-year plan for gradually transitioning to those alternatives while, again, making sure that we have just transition policies in place so that consumers and farmers and workers have ongoing access to not only income, food, and so on, but also other basic social services that can make us all more resilient in the face of whatever shocks to the system we might need to deal with. And this is true of economic disruption as well as the disruptions that would be associated with pandemics and climate change. So that is where I think we should focus. We should own the fact that there will be disruptions and costs and harms associated with food system reform, just like energy system reform, just like transportation system reform. But that is not a reason to maintain the status quo with fossil fuels, with cars that consume fossil fuels, with factory farming. In all cases, that is a reason to make a good plan, allow change to be gradual, and make sure everyone is taken care of as much as possible along the way. But in all these sectors, we ultimately do need transformative change. Okay, so I'll now open it up in a second for discussion, but I'll just close by briefly saying that the choice of 2050 as a target is not arbitrary. 2050 is already a target for climate change commitments, for biodiversity commitments. 2030 is a target for deforestation commitments. We are already going to have to substantially phase down industrial animal agriculture just to hit the climate change, biodiversity, and deforestation targets that countries have already committed to. And so I think 2050 is a good target for a global ban on industrial animal agriculture because it will already be a necessary target for achieving the other targets that are already in place. And so it syncs up well with those. Now, that is not to say that every country should, in fact, target 2050. That is meant to be a kind of general target. Those of us, like the United States, that are disproportionately responsible should aim lower, go for 2045. Countries that really are going to have to take their time more as they scale up food systems and take care of their populations, they might have to aim for 2055 or 2060. But 2050 can be the kind of center of gravity for international coordination around a global ban on industrial animal agriculture. And as I said before, this should be gradual. It should include financial policies, regulatory policies, informational policies, just transition policies. I can give examples of that in the discussion, but I don't want to go on anymore in the talk. So I will end now just by saying that I really do think this is one of those arguments that, at least in my view, is kind of straightforwardly correct. Like, this has not been a very inventive argument. I just listed some harms. I noted that these are classically the types of harms that ought to be the targets of bans as well as international bans, spelled out some precedents, and discussed how it can be done in a way that maximizes benefit and minimizes harm. So this has not been a very inventive argument, but I think it still surprises people because of how stigmatized the discussion of banning, or especially globally banning, this industry still are. And so I offer the argument in the spirit of, I hope, starting a conversation where we can think together about exactly how aspirational we should try to be in this domain for policymaking, and exactly what steps incrementally we can take that are realistic, achievable, sustainable, to get from where we are now in this political climate to where we eventually need to be, which I hope we can all agree is a world with no industrial animal agriculture, and where all we are debating is what to do about the small scale, extensive animal farming that might remain. So thank you for listening, and I'm excited to hear what your questions and comments are.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And thanks everyone who's still here to ask questions. So I'm going to unpin you. And then, yeah, so if people have questions, you can raise your hand and I will call on you, as I am the arbiter of that power. And you can unmute and unvideo or what video yourself and ask a question.
I can start off. Yeah, Jeff, I was curious about the leakage that you were talking about. I guess I was thinking, it seems like if the U.S. were to like ban industrial animal agriculture, and then just say, okay, we also won't import products that come from that, then wouldn't that stop a company from just like moving operations to Canada? And because there would be no more demand, right?
Yeah, a lot does depend on how these laws are made. Now, some products are going to be easier to regulate in those ways than other products, but you have seen an example of that, for example, with California's Proposition 12, which plays a similar role within the United States that a US ban would be playing regionally or globally, right? California is, of course, a US state, a particularly powerful one. It banned the production and sale of certain types of animal products within California. But because it banned the sale of those types of animal products, it did have effects that reverberated to other US states to the extent that they have interest in still marketing their products within California. And that, of course, raised all kinds of questions for the Supreme Court, which fortunately were resolved in California's favor. And so, yeah, depending on how the laws are written and depending on how monitoring and enforcement is done, it is possible to at least mitigate, if not eliminate, leakage concerns with regional bans by powerful actors. But it really does depend on those details, and it might not be perfect.
I had a question actually about Prop 12 as well, because I was going to ask
Mhm.
about that. Obviously, Trump won the election. That's really sad, but that's interesting for animal advocacy concerns, given that Biden administration did not like Prop 12, to
Mhm.
put it mildly. So
Mhm.
I don't know, how do you see the next 4 years in terms of your plan and what's going to happen with that? But then also just like regarding,
Yeah.
I guess, yeah, states' rights in this fight versus federal action.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, and thank you, Jonathan. See, talk to you later about this. Sorry, just taking a look at the chat while you ask about that. Yes, certainly the transition from the Biden administration to the Trump administration is going to affect prospects for any kind of food system reform at the federal level in the United States over the next 4 years. I think that much is pretty clear. Although in a way it might not that much for exactly the reason that you mentioned, which is the Biden administration was not exactly really, burning the midnight oil with Cory Booker's office, really trying to figure out how to get his farm reform bill through Congress. So in a way, the transition to the Trump administration might actually sustain the status quo in this policy area, which is total negligence and inaction and support for industry, right? So in general, when it comes to my policy engagement, I have been focusing on the local level and the international level, more or less skipping the federal level. And insofar as I engage with the federal level, I think a really productive area for conversation right now is with federal agencies insofar as they have discretion for how they enforce their own policies, because they might have opportunities to care more about certain issues like animal welfare, even if there are not yet more robust federal laws that require everyone to consider animal welfare. So at the local level, I've been working with the Greenie Center on environmental energy and land use law at NYU on a series of local policy reports about what cities and other local governments can do to support plant-based food systems and diets, as well as animal welfare more generally, like wild animal welfare. Because we think cities in particular, prominent cities like New York City, Austin, et cetera, cities can be really good policy laboratories, places where policy experiments happen, because cities tend to be a little bit more progressive, especially coastal cities like New York City. And bolder policies can more easily be passed at the city level. And then those can be construed as experiments. And if the experiments are successful, they can then be used as models for other cities to take up. And once a certain number of cities take it up, it can have a kind of grassroots effect that makes those sorts of policy changes more credible and legitimate at the state or federal level. So I like cities because they can be kind of playgrounds where bold policy experiments can take place. And then I like the international level because even though change is going to be much slower, much more moderate, much more mainstream at the international level, there can still be things like statements or declarations or agreements that something matters, something is credible, something is legitimate. For example, a couple of years ago, the UN called for a report about the nexus between animal welfare and sustainable development. That report is now underway. And as that is produced, and those conversations happen, hopefully there can be at least statements at the international level to the effect that we need to be working on this. And my hope is that if you have something like cities and states taking action down here, and then international communities at least making statements up here, and then things like federal agencies experimenting with how they interpret and apply their policies, then that can eventually, over time, along with shifting public opinion and economic circumstances, start to soften the ground at the federal level, such that in maybe 20 years, federal action is possible that seems unthinkable right now.
Cool. I have another question related to international coordination. Um, so I guess it seems like a lot of the environmental reforms that happened in the US in the 70s, like Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, happened basically just from domestic interests. And yeah, I was wondering, like, do you think that there's potential for that to happen without international coordination, just based on like the amount of like benefits that can happen domestically?
Yeah, I definitely think there can be, and in some ways, the diversity of harms that can be attributed to industrial animal agriculture are useful here because some are going to be more localized harms, and excuse me, others are going to be more globalized harms. So for example, many of the public health harms and environmental harms, especially associated with intensive animal agriculture, are local. They concern local disease outbreaks, local pollution, air, land, water. And so even if countries are ruthlessly self-interested, there are certainly going to be enough local harms to justify a ban, especially as like public opinion shifts and economic systems shift and food systems shift and so on. But I do think the global harms are worth emphasizing, even if they might not be the most salient ones for local actors initially, because the fossil fuel conversation is really instructive here. It has, at a certain point, become necessary to talk about this issue internationally, in part for all the reasons I mentioned before. Some of the harms are transboundary, and then there are these coordination action problems. And as you say, there might be ways of blocking or mitigating some of them, like banning the sale in a way that reverberates for producers elsewhere. But not all of them are going to be able to be addressed this way, particularly ones associated with administrative burdens, particularly ones associated with global injustice, and for example, the need to redistribute resources from the global north to the global south so that we can work together on energy system reform and food system reform. So yes, I think you absolutely can leverage local harms to justify local or regional bans, but you should not do that at the expense of like totally ignoring the global harms too. Those should always at least be lingering in the background as at least a secondary motivation so that when the time is right, we can be having those harder conversations too. That's my view, at least.
I think Bess had a question. I can.
Yeah, hi. My name is Bess. I'm at MIT. Thanks for the talk. This was great. I am wondering how much public opinion actually matters and how much the sort of
Mhm.
stigma attached to veganism and trying to ban or even just reduce animal agriculture operations, how much it sort of matters. I mean,
Mhm.
like lots of people didn't have takes on hydrofluorocarbons
Mhm.
prior to the sort of Montreal Protocol, and
Yeah.
people still have really like poor and limited understandings of things like human trafficking and like labor laws. Now,
Mhm.
it's true that the case with animals is a bit different in the sense that people have strong negative opinions about banning animal agriculture, um,
Mhm.
instead of no opinions. Or like sort of like empirically limited, uh, poorly empirically grounded opinions. But I mean, I guess like one thing that's cool about the idea of a global ban is that it's a bit it's a bit higher level. Like it seems like one thing that would be good about it would be that it would sort of it's doesn't have to be voted for. It doesn't really have to
Mhm.
be on the ballot. Like in
Mhm.
theory, there are international actors that can
Right.
as you say, make statements, declarations, this sort of thing without
Hmm.
having it voted on.
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
what you think about that.
Yeah. I mean, this is a really important question, and in some ways a really foundational question because it gets at the viability of democracy in a world with like such complicated, difficult to understand harms and so much like misinformation and disinformation and like echo chambers and so on and so forth. And we could have a debate about or a discussion about how much we should be trying to preserve like liberalism, democracy, capitalism, these like fundamental legal, political, economic systems. Of course, people are having those debates all the time about whether we should be updating or replacing these systems. I think for my purposes, it matters a lot to note that even if you are in that sense relatively conservative, you want to conserve these like basic foundational enterprises, liberalism, democracy, capitalism, which I think has a lot to be said for it. There are resources within those frameworks for moving towards this goal. It can be understood as like liberal and democratically legitimate. And I know you were not suggesting that we subvert democracy. I wanted to say that as a starting point. Now, when it comes to public surveys and public opinions, I did not go into much detail about my like decade to decade theory of change here because I wanted to open up the discussion. But I will say that I see the actual bans as occurring relatively late in the process, as a way of really sort of um, acknowledging and locking in changes that already took place as a result of some combination of incremental informational, financial, regulatory policies that each step of the way were democratically legitimate. And so, what I imagine is, for example, governments investing in informational policies that raise awareness about the impacts of industrial animal agriculture, the benefits of alternative food systems, financial policies that gradually shift subsidies away from industrial animal agriculture and towards alternatives that implement full cost pricing so that meat companies are forced to pay for the public health and environmental harms that they cause. And then all of this will gradually tick up the price of producing and consuming animal products and down the price of producing and consuming alternatives. Then there will be regulations that also make it harder to cut corners and treat animals and public health and the environment bad in the first place. That'll once again tick up the cost of industrial animal agriculture and, relatively speaking, tick down the cost of alternatives. And along the way, as I said, more of a social safety net, more just transition policies. And so if all that happens and you have these intermediate targets between now and 2050, then you will just see gradually, organically, people choosing both as workers and as consumers to support industrial animal agriculture less and alternatives more. And then when the bans actually come around in 2045, 2050, 2055, 2060, they will really just be a way of locking in those changes that organically happened because first of all, that prevents backsliding. And second of all, at that point, a ban has an expressive function. It means like we come together and say, that was not okay that we did that. And we will never again do that. Like that is not consistent with how we should be behaving now. So in that sense, I think you are right that we can get started with those first steps, even if public opinion does not yet, as a majority, support a ban. And then along the way, by the time we get to the point where a ban is appropriate, I think public opinion will have shifted so that a majority consistently does support a ban. Though as a final addendum, and then I'll stop and we can move on in the conversation, I'll say that there is actually survey data that suggests a bunch of people support a ban now. There was one survey where 50% of people supported a ban on these practices now. Now, I think we have to take that with an enormous pinch of salt because survey data in both directions is really unreliable and misleading. And it depends on how you frame the question. And people might not realize the significance of their answers. They might say, of course, I think we should ban slaughterhouses without realizing that slaughterhouses are responsible for like 90 something percent of meat production. So, all caveats, but insofar as we care about survey data, it is already surprisingly far along the way, depending on how the questions are asked.
Okay, we probably have time for one more question if it's out there. takers.
What do you think students should be doing to move towards this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one really, really important point, and maybe this is a good thread of the conversation to close with if we are closing after this question, is part of why this conversation about food system reform has been frustrating. I mean, this is true about many, many conversations, is that it tends to be framed in this kind of simple binary either or way where the question is, should we be engaging in like moderate reformist work or more radical, like transformative work? Or should we be engaging in like individual consumer behavioral change versus like more structural, like policy or economic change? And should we be like nice and conciliatory in our advocacy versus sort of confrontational and alienating in our advocacy? And I think that I say that in response to your question because I think that that debate is frustrating in part because the answer is almost always yes. Some combination of all of those things should be happening. And the only question is what the ratio and distribution should be and what the details should be in each case and which actors should be taking which approach in which situation. And so there is no one size fits all answer to the question, what should a student be doing? I think we need moderate action and radical action. We need vegan outreach, like individual consumer change, and we need like policy outreach, corporate pressure campaigns or political campaigns like referendum, that sort of thing. And some of it needs to be like moderate and conciliatory, like really friendly, like, oh, thank you so much for participating in Meatless Mondays. And some of it should be like radical and confrontational and alienating, like how dare you consume flesh, that sort of thing. And it really is a question that each individual has to figure out for themselves based on who they are, what their social roles are, how they come across to people, what their professional roles are, how they come across to people. Like, how am I well positioned given my social and professional roles, my personality, how I come across? How am I well positioned in this context to move the conversation forward? And for some people, that might mean sucking it up and working with the meat industry and with the government to make painstakingly slow tweaks to the system that feel like not enough, but are an important step on the path. For other people, it means being outside of the system and doing grassroots outreach and field building, or yelling at people. I mean, maybe not being super annoying, but you get the idea, being assertive and confrontational. And it just kind of requires trial and error experimentation to figure out like what that means for you as an individual. But the good news is there are lots of roles to be played. So if one thing feels like a bad fit, other things could be good fits.